we'll move on to the next item. We've already covered a budget request with Deputy Superintendent Scott Jones. Next up is our legislative policy and statutory priorities. So we have Tiffany. Seems like we're missing someone who's not feeling very well, but we're pleased to have you here. So
happy to be here.
We'll turn the time over. So state name, title,
yes, so
all
Tiffany
of that.
Stanley,
Everything
policy
but your
advisor with the State Board of Education. So Angie usually uses this time to go over the 2018 general session request for statutory changes, and that's in your board backup for this item. My understanding is that there's one other issue that is not necessarily a statutory change, but maybe a budgetary item that Jill Curry wanted to address with you to ensure that you're comfortable with the proposed approach. So I will turn the time over to her. Oh, yeah. But in the meantime, while she's logging in, are there any questions on this proposed list of changes?
Okay, Board Member Lear.
Are there any new updates new from last month?
No.
Okay. And maybe now's not an appropriate time. Tell me if it's not. But I was asking about any other bills or issues that you know of, despite the fact that they're not on this list. Do you know of any that we should know about?
I don't. I mean, so there are legislators who will reach out for technical input and those types of things, but there aren't others that, you know, the staff is initiating on their own that would need to seek board approval.
But anything you're hearing about that would enlighten us?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Jill Curry, Fiscal Policy Analyst, State Board of Education. So on the screen, I'll zoom in a minute. But on the screen is a diagram of all of the appropriations that go through public education. The current proposal that we want to bring before the entire board today is to move what's called the education contracts line item to the related to basic school program line item. And I'll break that down so it makes more sense. So if you look at the diagram under green, those are all of the appropriations that go to the minimum school program. If you look at the items that are in blue, those are all of the appropriations that go through what we call the education agencies or the State Board of Education. So I'm going to zoom in first on that blue section. It's okay, let me zoom in once. Okay. So within or under the State Board of Education or under the education agencies is a line item that is called education contracts. Within the education contracts line item are two distinct programs. One is called Youth Center, and the other one is called Corrections Institutions. And I'm going to first tell you a little bit about each of the line items. So the Youth Center is the program that provides funding to children at the Utah State Hospital in Provo. The Utah State Board of Education contracts with Provo School District to provide an educational program for all school-age children at the state hospital's Oak Springs School. Under the proposed change, which I'll get into a little bit more, this funding would be moved from this blue area over to green, so over to the minimum school program, and it would be placed within the Youth in Custody program. The Youth in Custody program provides funding to support educational services for students who are in the custody of the Utah Department of Human Services, students who are in a juvenile detention facility, or an equivalent agency of a tribe recognized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Next, I'm going to talk about the corrections institutions piece of this line item, and then I'm going to talk about why this may be a budgetary change that you would want to support. So also within education contracts, you can see the other piece of it is corrections institutions. This program provides funding for school districts, applied technology colleges, colleges and universities that have correctional facilities within their boundaries to provide educational services for inmates. Under the proposed change, this funding, again, would move from this blue area of the budget to the green, so it would move under the minimum school program, and this would be placed with adult education. Okay, so why is this change being proposed? Probably the most important reason is that Provo School District wanted to discontinue their contract with the state board because they were not receiving enough money to cover their costs to provide the educational services at the state hospital. If you look at appropriations for education contracts over time, they've been relatively flat. So for Youth Center in fiscal year 2002, was as far back as I dug, the legislature appropriated about $1.16 million for Youth Center. Fast forward 16 years, and for fiscal year 2018, the legislature appropriated about 1.15 for Youth Center, or slightly less than it did in fiscal year 2002. Let me show you a bar chart with that. So again, the blue bar shows how much Youth Center received in fiscal year 2002. Fast forward to fiscal year 2018, that amount has declined slightly. With the economic downturn, it certainly has not risen. So I think the information that we've heard from Provo School District correlates with the information we see in terms of what has been appropriated. So what is the benefit of moving these programs to under the minimum school program? Well, both the youth in custody program and adult education programs typically receive enrollment growth and also WPU increases. It's not required in statute, but the legislature has typically funded these types of increases for those two programs. Thus, making this budgetary change would help ensure adequate funding and specifically deliver the right amount of funding to Provo School District to provide the services that they're providing to the state hospital. And if I go back to our massive budgetary diagram, I can show you where we're proposing that funding should be moved. So if you look in the kind of middle column, that's the funding that falls under the related to basic school program, or that falls below the line. And let me zoom in. And there you can see that for on this sheet are the funding amounts for fiscal year 2017. You can see Youth in Custody has $21.5 million in ongoing appropriations, and adult education has a little over $10.5 million ongoing in appropriations. So with that, I can take any questions.
Board Member Lear?
Is this something that the youth in custody staff supports?
Yeah.
Because I know over the years that's been an unusually effective program and given other states, and I just want to make sure this is something that they support and is not being taken from them.
No, so this change is actually related to work that is being done by Deputy Superintendent Stallings, Steve Kalin, Travis Cook, and Brian Olmstead through a working group of the Law and Licensing Committee. So,
Okay. All right, thank you.
Board Member Hanson?
I was going to say, yes, this is the subcommittee that I was chairing. If you remember right, that we had an MOU from Provo. Do you remember that? And then Provo didn't think they wanted to continue funding this because they didn't have sufficient money and all of that. So we went out there, we had a working group, we had several meetings with them, and this is part of their, what they'd like us to do in order for them to maintain working with those students there. Otherwise, we would have to come up with some other scenario, which would be very difficult.
Thank you for giving us that update. Vice Chair Brittany, comments?
I have two questions. One, so over here in the related to basic program, I'm guessing that it would have growth over time. There's a growth cut. Okay. And so that's the value in moving it.
Yes.
And then my second question, if that's okay, Chair, is will youth in custody still be an appropriate name for that category if we're pulling students who are in from the hospital in Provo?
I think that's a great question, and I'm probably not the right person to decide whether that is the correct name. I think certainly if the board thinks that that program should be renamed, that could be brought to the Public Education Appropriations Subcommittee and recommend that the name be changed for that.
If I might comment on the name change, there'd be a benefit of that because as you're looking at historical, all these little boxes have history associated with it, and with this change, proposed change, it changes all of that. So it's new. But I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Is Provo district the only district that uses these funds? It's only limited to Provo? I'm curious.
Yes, because the funds are only for the children at the school-age children at the
that school.
Utah State
Okay.
Hospital.
So
So
it doesn't
yes,
affect any other
no.
programs or districts that are happening with other correctional facilities and that. And
Correct.
okay, thank you. Any other? Not seeing any other questions. So what can we expect moving forward? Is this maybe a name change, but I don't know. But what's the future steps?
So this, the way that Deputy Superintendent Stallings had thought about approaching it is that we would move forward after hearing from the board, move forward and make a recommendation to the Office of the Legislative Fiscal Analyst to make this budgetary change. And then if that recommendation was made, then the Public Education Appropriations Subcommittee would vote to make that change.
Okay, so the way I'm seeing this playing out is there's a proposed betterment to address some of these concerns, and you need direction from the board, or might be a motion to support the changes. Vice Chair Brittany, comment?
I move that we instruct staff to go forward seeking this appropriation change. Don't know what all the names are anymore, the boxes, but as well as to possibly look at a possible name change for that particular item, the youth in custody box.
Okay, do we have a second? Plenty of seconds. Discussion to the motion. Board Member Hanson?
I think this is on the law and licensing agenda for tomorrow morning, so I don't know how that all fits together, but I thought I'd better bring that up.
Okay. Well, it might change coming out of that too. So with future recommendations, but this directs staff to start taking action
That'd be great.
now. So any other questions or comments to the motion? Seeing none, let's vote on it. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Voting was unanimous. Thank you. Is there anything else that
Legislation.
on the legislation?
Yeah, we've got a
Okay.
So we talked about maybe taking the opportunity to quickly show you a couple of resources for bill tracking during the session. since we won't see you again until the first week of the session during one of our Thursday meetings up on the Hill. So I think you're probably pretty familiar with the legislature's website. It did change recently, so you'll notice that it looks a little bit different. But there's this handy search bar now, so you can search for bill numbers if you know them, sponsors if you know them, even subjects. But so SB 40, let's say, and then, click on the bill, it'll take you there, and I'm sure you're fairly familiar with that. There's a couple of resources here that are helpful, I think. So the calendar, that's where you'll find all the agendas for each committee meeting. And one thing that's helpful there is, let me actually go to one of the committees from last year. So just to show you essentially that the audio, if you are unable to listen live or attend in person, is bookmarked by motion and by person. So it's really easy to find and track. That's there on the committee web pages. What else on this? Another thing that's helpful is you can actually find all of the public bill file requests for the session that relate to education. So if you go to just bills and then go down to education, you can find all the public numbered bills and then all the public bill file requests. So these are bills that don't have text yet, but you can see what may be coming as far as public bill file requests. Of course, there's a whole slew of others that are not public, but you can find those here. So that's the public tracking kind of ways that you can track what's going on. But also, we internally create a tracking sheet. There's a public version. So I have it pulled up here. This is actually the internal version. The public version doesn't have quite as many fields, but we'll plan to provide access to the board to the internal version. That includes things like staff to contact. So, whatever staff has expertise related to the bill topic, whether the sponsor has coordinated with the board on the legislation, whether rulemaking is required, the fiscal impact, all of that will be there. And of course, we're open to suggestions on where you would like to access that bill tracking sheet and whether you would like other information on that internal bill tracking sheet. So feel free to take a look or let us know now if you know offhand, if you have any suggestions.
Can you just walk through it going left to right so that all of us, it's a little bit of a training, but I think it'll be very helpful before we make any comments.
Yep. So we cull all of the legislation into anything that could affect education in any way, shape, or form. So we pull, so we pull all the related bills out. And then there's a hyperlink to the bill here in this column. And then you have the short title of the bill, the sponsor, chief sponsor of the bill, a summary of the bill, which is really just the long title of the bill. And then whether or not the board has taken a position on the bill, the status of the bill, which will change during the session, whether it's in the possession, it's really whose possession it's in, a committee, the floor, legislative research. And then, like I mentioned, you'll have staff with expertise in that area if you have questions, whether or not the sponsor is coordinated with the board or staff on the bill, whether rulemaking is required by the bill, whether the bill has a fiscal impact, and then any other related notes.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Board Member Lisa. We have a question from Board Member Lisa Cummins.
Thank you, Chair. This might be a little bit overwhelming, Tiffany, but I have a question. Do you cover bills that include education, like through workforce services and health and human services and all of that stuff?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
That's
So,
a lot of work.
yeah. This
How many
tracking sheet
bills so
gets
far?
really
About
long.
1,200?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, so that's all covered in here then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. These are just, and these are those bills that have been numbered publicly, which of course, those which are in Title 53A won't be numbered publicly until after the recodification occurs. And that bill is passed the first.
Right, but
week
these
of
are
July.
also bills that are not
Exactly.
exclusively
In Title
listened
53.
to in education in committees but they're also in others.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other board, superintendent?
I just want to add a piece on fiscal notes. Assistant Superintendent Grange, I'm not sure how many your staff has tackled already during the holidays. They were starting to come in, but one of the things for board members to be aware of, there might be, for example, a piece of legislation that you've asked for input on or you've asked to be run. And, you know, we try to think fiscally upfront of the cost, but sometimes when we start looking at the language and we run numbers, there is not only cost internally to your staff in terms of operations, but also there's some inherent cost at times out to the LEAs. So we may have not talked about a fiscal note in conversation with the board, but things will come up from time to time. And so I don't know, Assistant Superintendent Grange, if you have something to add about where they can find that information once it's posted, or how we just, if fiscal notes, they're kind of coming really fast and it's hard to keep you abreast of all of those. I mean, they come in the middle of the night sometimes and we have a 24-hour turnaround. So I'm not sure how to best get that information to you, but it's really important that you are aware of all the fiscal notes coming and going.
Fiscal impact is, yeah.
Is it the final one?
So just for those of you who aren't, Natalie Grange, Assistant Superintendent of Financial Operations, for those who haven't been part of this process or entered really early last year and kind of got the fire hose trying to figure this all out, on the spreadsheet that has been provided to you, is this the fiscal impact as the LEA or the LFA decides, the final one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so just to keep in mind, our office submits a fiscal impact or a fiscal note that often takes into consideration impacts on LEAs and what our office thinks the impacts will be on specific pieces of legislation. The LFA doesn't have to accept our fiscal note, and oftentimes we go back and forth having conversations about the actual impact or ways to mitigate the fiscal impact. Or Medicaid, yes, that would be helpful too. The LFA is the one that makes the final decision, the Legislative Fiscal Analyst's Office. In some cases, the fiscal impact that you see being reported out on the legislature's website is not entirely reflective of what we submitted as an impact. This fiscal impact generally doesn't go to the level of detail on LEA impact. And if you remember the discussions that we had last year, bills don't include funding for third-party impact. So if we determine that we'd have to build a system and the LEAs have to build a system, the fiscal impact for the cost of the building here would be reflected in the fiscal note. But the cost of the LEAs isn't on that fiscal note. And for those of you who interact a lot with your constituents during the session, oftentimes there's a lot of frustration about the fact that we don't do a good job reflecting the impacts on the LEAs. And part of that is because you don't see it. It's not included in the summaries that you receive. So if in the past few years, we haven't presented our office's fiscal input and then the comparison between what was finally decided on by the LFA. If there's a bill that becomes particularly concerning or people want more information, we can provide that to you. The other thing, just to make you aware, it's probably not something that's on your radar, but with the recodification bills that have been proposed and been accepted thus far, the bills related to education code are not being numbered and released. We're seeing a few trickle in here and there, but we're hearing that there are hundreds waiting in the wings that once that recod bill is passed, they will push all of those bills through with the recodified statute, which means the first 2 or 3 weeks of the session are not going to be pleasant, just because usually we have a lot more, and we've been doing a lot more fiscal notes over the past month. We haven't seen a lot. It's been sort of nice, but we all know that it's going to kind of hammer down the first 2 weeks of the session. And so you will be seeing a substantial amount of bills pop up on this sheet and on the fiscal note sheets. We will, if you have questions, please let us know. We'd be happy to do whatever we can to help you understand that. But the first couple of weeks are going to be a lot more hairy than they have been in the past, I believe.
Vice Chair Ellis.
I know that this is all a lot of work, so my ask, I understand, is even more work. But you mentioned the impact on the local entities. How much more difficult would it be to determine that, how much that would be? Because I think that's an important thing for the legislators to recognize as well, because there's a lot of things that we at the state level say did not cost any money, and then local districts end up having to spend a lot of money.
So impact on third parties, the public, as well as our local LEAs, is a part of every fiscal note. Every bill that comes through, we have to take that into consideration and report that back. It's just that the legislature doesn't always appropriate funds to compensate those costs, if that makes sense. And that's where I think you as board members get a little bit of pushback from your constituents, is that we do call around to various LEAs. We have groups that we email, we have groups that we call to get information to try to assess the impact, both in urban districts and rural districts and with our charter schools. We have a quick turnaround on our notes, but we try to be reflective of those costs at all aspects of the educational process.
Thank you. Other questions or comments?
Can I add one? Emily Wheeler, Public Information Officer. I just wanted to discuss the communications that we will be having throughout the session. So for the last several years, I've issued a weekly email that has a schedule of the upcoming committee meetings and where they are and any other meetings associated with the board. And I wanted to check with all of you to see if that is still what you would like, and or if you would like anything in addition to that or any changes.
Board Member Lear.
This is kind of a Spencer comment, so I hesitate, but briefly. But speaking of those kinds of lists, you put out one list one time about meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And since it's such a busy time related to the legislature, is there a chance that you could do that still in an ongoing way? That was so helpful. And it lasted about 1 month, so I wasn't sure if it was that much work or.
No, I can definitely do that. Things calmed down a little bit in the middle of December, so there wasn't a lot to notify you about, but I had planned to continue
I would love
that.
to have, no, of all, not just the legislative meetings, but all other meetings too.
I'll get that to you in
Thank
one
you.
form or another.
That would be really, really helpful.
Board Member Stokes.
May I direct a question to Member Lear?
Because it
For,
was
for
random.
clarity or something and
Yeah.
regarding the subject.
Yeah, how was that a Spencer comment?
Well, it's because it was a little random.
Oh, random. Okay.
Oh.
I do have something to add to the list when we get to the point of adding bills to the list.
Okay. So Emily, I think that
Yeah.
unless there's other comments, I think we have these expectations of you to continue doing what you're doing.
Okay. And I will note that I usually wait as long as possible to send that weekly email out because committee meetings tend to take longer and longer to be posted as the session goes on. So I usually wait for as many as possible to be up and agendas to be up to send that out, but expect them sometime before the beginning of the
And I'm
week.
even less concerned about legislative meetings than the other related meetings. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks.
Did you have another comment?
I don't.
Okay. I keep catching your light, so thank you. Well, please continue. What else do we have?
That's it. That's it for us.
Okay. So Board Member Stokes, we're to that part of our discussion that you want to
Excellent.
talk about.
So one of the things we discussed in our, as we just went through the painstaking process of changing or voting on chair and vice chair, and we came to the conclusion that we had to do this every year based upon legislation.
I think we have that.
Does anybody? Yeah.
Yep. And
Somebody
I think
nodding their head.
that's on our list.
Is it on the list?
Uh-huh.
How? I mean,
I'm looking
This
for
is
it.
kind of a Carol Lear comment, but where is it? where is it on the
It's
list?
in my head.
All
I
right,
think
now
it's
let's-
there, but I'm not sure.
Let's keep the
Oh, here
questions
we go.
direct.
It's number 3. It's number 3 under board approved requests for statutory changes.
Number 3.
So the board recommends that the
Okay,
legislature,
thank you.
yeah.
All right.
I'm not sure I support it anymore. We need to vote again.
Can I ask a question?
Any other,
Sister?
oh, sorry, Board Member Hanson.
And I might have missed it. Last month, we talked about where at the Capitol we were going to meet. Did we decide where?
It's the Capitol Boardroom, right? Capitol Boardroom. Yeah. Capitol Boardroom. I think there's maybe 1 week where we couldn't get it, and I can't remember what the backup is, but, yep. And we can send out appointments to get
It'll
them
be on
the
a
calendar.
schedule.
Yep.
Yeah.
From noon to
On the
1:30 on
communications.
Thursdays.
Yeah, and I will add all those to the Google Calendar if you're on it. And if you're not on that, talk to me. I can get you on it.
And if we can route those communications as they're going out, to let Lorraine know, because on her side, she can shoot out some additional to just make sure as we're communicating out there, it's sticking to something. And that at least you know if you're missing a communication or not. Okay, so we'll try to do better on that communication side. I know there's some Outlook challenges and some things go to junk mail and a few other things. So thank you. Okay, thank you.